Panama City Beach, Florida. Early morning, days before the summer crowds arrive, the water lies flat and pewter-colored under a sky that hasn't decided on color yet. A charter fishing boat idles out past the sandbar, engine low, running lights still on. The captain has made this same run for 11 years. Bait, then blue water, then bottom fish before the wind picks up. He has seen dolphin pods roll past the bow 1,000 times. He has seen pilot whales twice, both times far offshore. What breaks the surface less than 2 miles from the beach at 6:14 that morning is neither. It is too large. It rolls too slowly. The dive is too deliberate, unhurried, almost geological, as if something the size of a school bus has decided the ocean owes it no urgency at all. Then the exhale, a single, angled spout, thrown forward and to the left, unmistakable to anyone who has spent time around deep-diving whales. A sperm whale's blow does not look like other whales' blows. It leans. The mate keys the radio. His voice cracks between disbelief and alarm. You're not going to believe this. That's a sperm whale, 2 miles off the beach. A pause, then quieter. That's not supposed to be here. The deckhand fumbles for his phone. By the time the camera is up, there is nothing left but a widening ring on the surface and a faint sulfur smell in the air. The exhaled breath of something that had been holding it for the better part of an hour. The captain cuts the throttle and drifts, scanning the water for a shadow that does not return. Behind him, the beach is still empty. The lifeguard towers are unmanned. Nobody else on land will ever know this happened, except through a second-hand account and a dispatcher's log. By the time the boat circles back for a second look, the animal is gone, sounding into water that is, according to every chart on board, far too shallow for what it needs to survive. No photograph, no confirmed follow-up sighting, just a radio call logged by a dispatcher, a captain who will tell this story for years, and a question that outlives the encounter. Why do animals that spend their lives over more than a mile of open water beneath them keep surfacing close enough to see from a beach chair? According to the official record, that whale should not have been there at all. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration maps the Gulf of Mexico's resident sperm whale population as a deep water species. Full stop. Not an animal that avoids the coast out of habit, but one that is physiologically restricted to water it cannot function without. Sperm whales dive to feed on squid at depths of thousands of feet, dives that can last upward of 90 minutes. Their entire foraging economy is built around a water column the Florida coastline simply does not have. NOAA's own regional marine mammal biologists have said as much in plain terms after nearly every documented encounter. These are animals that live far out, in deep water, hunting prey almost no one will ever see, and they are not expected to turn up close to shore. The population itself is well studied, at least by the standards of an animal that spends nearly all of its life underwater. Ship and aerial surveys conducted across the northern Gulf between 1996 and 2001 produced an abundance estimate near 1,349 individuals. A more recent assessment, built from oceanic surveys run in the summers of 2017 and 2018, and published by federal researcher Laura Garrison and colleagues in 2020, put the number closer to 1,180. Within that broader population, a tighter core group, the whales most consistently tied to the underwater canyon systems between Mississippi Canyon and DeSoto Canyon, hugging the 1,000-meter depth contour, has been estimated at roughly 398 individuals, with a plausible range between 253 and 607. DeSoto Canyon sits at the center of this model for a reason. It is where the continental shelf breaks apart into the kind of vertical terrain sperm whales prefer, walls and trenches that concentrate the squid they hunt. It is deep, it is far from the beach, and it is, according to the model, where the Gulf's whales are supposed to stay. That is the frame science has built. Depth, not distance, is the rule. And depth, by definition, does not exist 2 miles off Panama City Beach. The question, then, is not whether sperm whales can tolerate shallow, warm coastal water for any length of time. On paper, they cannot. not comfortably, not for long, not by choice. The question is not whether the population model is wrong about where these whales prefer to live. It almost certainly is not. The question is why an animal defined almost entirely by its need for deep water keeps a documented habit of turning up in water that isn't, and why the pattern of when and where it happens looks less like a string of unrelated accidents and more like something with a shape. To understand how that shape is even physically possible, it helps to look at what actually lies beneath the Gulf of Mexico's surface, rather than what a range map implies from above. The Gulf is not a bowl of uniform depth. Off much of peninsular Florida's west coast, the continental shelf is unusually wide and shallow. The West Florida shelf extends more than 100 miles out in places before the seafloor finally drops away. But off the Florida Panhandle, where DeSoto Canyon cuts into the shelf edge, that margin narrows considerably. Deep water and continental slope habitat sit closer to the coastline there than almost anywhere else in the eastern Gulf. The core sperm whale range and the Florida coast are not, geographically, worlds apart. They are neighbors, separated by a strip of shelf that, in places, a whale could cross in a matter of hours. That proximity does not, on its own, explain why a deep-diving animal would choose to cross it. But it removes the excuse of distance. This is not a species that would need to travel 1,000 miles out of its known range to end up in water shallow enough to see from a boat rail. In places, it would need to travel a few dozen. Add to that the Gulf's own circulation pattern. The loop current pulls warm water up from the Yucatan Channel and pushes it in a wide, clockwise arc across the eastern Gulf, occasionally spinning off eddies that drift toward the Florida shelf carrying deep water nutrients and the squid and fish that follow them into water closer to shore than those nutrients would otherwise reach. A whale is not required to abandon its feeding strategy to end up near the coast. The coast, on occasion, is brought a little closer to the whale. None of this makes the near-shore water hospitable to a sperm whale for any real length of time. It only means the barrier between deep water habitat and Florida's coastline is thinner and more permeable than a static range map is built to show. And travel toward the coast, on the available record, keeps happening. Not in one place, not in one year, but scattered across more than a decade of Florida's coastline, on both its Gulf and Atlantic sides. In December of 2012, a sperm whale estimated at 35 to 40 feet long was seen floating and struggling less than 50 feet from shore off Pompano Beach, on the Atlantic side of the state, before its carcass drifted in near the Deerfield Beach fishing pier. In June of 2021, a 29-foot female stranded on Shell Island near Panama City, the same stretch of coastline where the opening encounter of this investigation took place, and died before rescue teams could reach her. In March of 2024, a 44-foot adult male came ashore on a sandbar in Venice, on the Gulf side, close enough that beachgoers could wade toward the police tape, strung up to hold them back. In June of 2025, a juvenile just over 13 feet long washed up on a beach in Miami. 4 documented cases, 4 different life stages of the same species: juvenile, subadult female, mature male. 2 different coastlines of the same state. None of them, individually, breaks the official model, which allows for occasional strandings of sick or injured animals. But laid end to end, chronologically, they describe something the very rare event framing does not quite prepare you for: a coastline that keeps receiving visits from a species whose home, according to the map, is somewhere else entirely. If you have followed the pattern this far, 4 cases, 2 coasts, more than a decade apart, you are already doing what this channel exists to do: reading the gap between what the record confirms and what it merely fails to rule out. Subscribe, because that gap is where every case in this series lives, and it never fully closes. Population size alone does not obviously explain a coastal pull. A few hundred whales concentrated around a canyon system is not, on the surface, a population straining against its own limits. But sperm whale society is not a single, uniform herd moving as one unit. It is built around stable matrilineal groups, females and their calves, tied to a home range they rarely abandon, and around males, who leave those groups at sexual maturity and spend much of their adult lives ranging alone or in loose bachelor associations across far greater distances, chasing food and, eventually, mates in populations entirely different from the one they were born into. That structural split matters. A 2009 genetic study led by researcher Diane Engelhaupt examined mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, from Gulf of Mexico sperm whales and compared it against animals from the western North Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Mediterranean. The result was clear. The Gulf's females are genetically distinct, effectively a population that stays home. But when the same researchers examined nuclear DNA inherited from both parents, that sharp distinction disappeared. Males, it turns out, are moving between those ocean basins in numbers large enough to erase the genetic boundary that separates the females so cleanly. In other words, the mothers stay. The sons wander, sometimes for thousands of miles, sometimes into entirely different populations over the course of a single lifetime. If any segment of the Gulf's sperm whales is biologically inclined to test the edges of its own mapped range, science has already identified which one. Layer onto that a second detail buried in the survey data itself. The whales tracked most closely between Mississippi Canyon and DeSoto Canyon are not the Gulf's only aggregation. Vessel surveys run in the summers of 2012 and 2014, north of the dry Tortugas in the far southeastern Gulf, identified a separate cluster of sperm whales tied to its own distinct oceanographic features. A group researchers noted may be functionally different from the one anchored around DeSoto Canyon, and one that sits, geographically, considerably closer to Florida's west coast than the canyon-based model most people picture when they hear Gulf sperm whale population. The map most people are shown is one population in one place. The record suggests at least two in two places, one of which already lives closer to Florida's shoreline than the official story implies. On the morning of Sunday, March 10th, 2024, at roughly 7 a.m., an adult male sperm whale came ashore on a sandbar at Service Club Park in Venice, Florida. Close enough to land that city officials described the animal's position as roughly 50 yards from the beach. Video from the scene, later broadcast statewide, showed the whale's tail thrashing in shallow water as boats from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office circled at a distance, unable to safely approach. The animal measured close to 44 feet and weighed an estimated 70,000 pounds, several times the mass of a loaded school bus. Laura Engelby, branch chief of NOAA's Southeast Regional Marine Mammal Division, arrived to lead a multi-agency response that included the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and biologists from Mote Marine Laboratory. Gretchen Lovewell, who runs Mote's stranding response program and had worked there for nearly 15 years by that point, put the animal's presence in blunt terms. Her lab had never responded to a sperm whale on that stretch of coast before. For an animal that size, at that location, it was without precedent in her professional memory. The whale did not survive. Rescue teams worked through the day, unable to safely sedate or refloat an animal several times the length of most of the boats circling it. It died in the early hours of Monday, March 11th. Engelby described the whale as very thin, a description consistent in her assessment with an animal that had likely been struggling with illness or injury well before it ever came near shore. NOAA's stated position on this point is direct. Healthy sperm whales do not approach shallow coastal water. When one does, something has almost always already gone wrong with it. Necropsy samples were collected, though full toxicology and pathology results, as is standard for large marine mammal deaths, were not expected for months. The carcass itself was eventually towed 10 to 15 miles offshore for disposal. The animal's last physical presence removed from the water it should never have entered in the first place. It was not supposed to be there. It was there anyway. Every fact in that case is forensically documented. Coordinates, timestamps, agency names, a necropsy report on file. What the record cannot answer is the question underneath all of it. Not how a sick sperm whale ends up near a Florida beach. Illness plausibly explains that, case by case. But why, Across more than a decade, 6 sperm whales keep choosing this particular stretch of coastline, in a species whose entire mapped population is supposed to live somewhere else. Whether or not any individual whale is physically capable of reaching Florida's nearshore water is, at this point, no longer a meaningful question. The biology already answers it. Sperm whales are among the most far-ranging mammals on Earth. Satellite tagging research conducted in the Gulf under marine mammal researcher Bruce Mate, whose tagging program tracked deep-diving whales across ocean basins for decades, documented at least one Gulf sperm whale traveling the length of the basin. From the northern Gulf, near the canyon systems off Louisiana and the Florida Panhandle, down into the southern Gulf, a transit of hundreds of miles completed as part of the animal's normal, unremarkable movement pattern. A follow-up analysis by researchers Windsor, Irvine, and Mate, published in 2017, mapped the spatial distribution of these tagged whales in relation to human activity across the Gulf, and confirmed what earlier tracking had already suggested. Individual range for this species is not measured in tens of miles. It is measured in hundreds. Picture it this way. If a Gulf sperm whale's normal, undramatic monthly movement were scaled down to a human commute, it would be the equivalent of someone routinely driving from Miami to Washington, D.C. and back, without anyone finding the trip unusual enough to mention. A whale that completes that kind of open water transit, as a matter of course, is not stretched thin by a coastal detour, measured in single-digit miles. The genetic picture adds a second layer. The male-mediated gene flow identified between Gulf and Atlantic sperm whale populations means that, at some point in most male whales' lives, an individual leaves the water where it was born and does not return to the same patch of ocean. Some of that movement crosses entire ocean basins. Some of it, biologically, could just as easily terminate in a slow drift toward an unfamiliar coastline instead of a familiar one. The same wandering instinct documented at ocean basin scale does not switch off conveniently at the edge of a continental shelf. There is also the matter of what a sperm whale's body is built to withstand. Its enormous head houses the spermaceti organ, a reservoir of waxy oil the animal uses to fine-tune its buoyancy on the way down and the way back up. An adaptation for repeatedly crossing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of feet of pressure change in a single dive. An animal engineered to tolerate that kind of vertical extreme is not fragile with respect to horizontal distance. The physiology that lets it hunt at depth is, incidentally, the same physiology that lets it cross open water, largely indifferent to how far the nearest coastline happens to be. None of this proves that any specific whale, on any specific morning, chose to approach the Florida coast on purpose, in good health, for reasons science has not yet cataloged. But it does establish, without ambiguity, that the physical and behavioral capacity for that kind of movement already exists inside this species, verified by tagging data, genetic sampling, and decades of published research. The only open question is how often that capacity gets used in ways nobody happens to be watching. That question runs directly into an obvious objection, and it deserves to be asked plainly. If sperm whales are capable of this kind of movement, and if some population of them may already sit closer to Florida's coastline than the standard model assumes, where is the evidence, beyond a handful of tragic strandings, that any of this is actually happening? It is a fair challenge, and the honest answer starts by conceding the skeptic's strongest point. Every documented coastal encounter examined in this investigation involved an animal that was already compromised. The Venice whale was described as very thin. The Pompano beach whale in 2012 showed scarring consistent with a vessel strike and was already struggling by the time it was spotted. The Miami juvenile had likely lost contact with its mother. None of these were healthy whales making a confident, purposeful approach to shore. NOAA's baseline explanation, a sick or disoriented individual, not a pattern, holds up, case by case, exactly as well as officials have said it does. But that explanation runs into 4 separate structural gaps once the individual cases are considered together, as a body of evidence, rather than as isolated incidents. The first is coverage. In nearly 3 decades of Gulf sperm whale research, only 5 dedicated abundance surveys have ever been conducted in 2003, 2004, 2009, 2017, and 2018. In the vast majority of calendar time between those years, essentially no systematic effort has been watching where this species actually goes. And the surveys that do exist are built to cover water starting at the 200-meter depth contour out to the edge of the U.S. exclusive economic zone. Near shore water, the strip closest to the beach, the strip every stranding in this investigation occurred in, sits entirely outside the boundary the surveys were designed to monitor. The absence of documented sightings in that zone is not evidence the whales aren't there. It is evidence nobody was set up to look. The second is detection bias. A sperm whale spends the overwhelming majority of its life below the surface, diving for up to 90 minutes at a stretch. Even a whale transiting through coastal water directly off a populated beach would be visible, on average, for only a fraction of the time it spends there. Most such transits, if they occur, would simply never surface at a moment when anyone happened to be looking in the right direction. The third is evidence decomposition, literal in this case. Carcasses that could otherwise be examined get towed out to sea for public health and safety reasons before a full necropsy can be completed. In December 2012, Deerfield Beach's mayor refused to allow the stranded whale's body to be examined on the sand at all, citing the smell and the tourist season, and had it towed more than 5 miles out instead. In 2021, the Shell Island whale died before rescue teams could reach it. Each time, part of the forensic record that might have clarified cause, origin, or travel history was lost before science could fully process it. The fourth is simple scale. Florida's combined Gulf and Atlantic coastline stretches well over 1,000 miles. No stranding network, however dedicated, can maintain constant observation across that much shoreline. A pattern could persist for years, visible only in scattered, disconnected local news reports, without ever being assembled into the kind of data set that would force a formal reconsideration of the species' mapped range. None of this confirms that sperm whales are approaching Florida's coast more often or with more purpose than the official record currently allows. It does not confirm that at all. But it does not let the isolated sick animal explanation fully close the case, either. Not when 4 such animals, in 4 different life stages, keep independently choosing the one stretch of American coastline. The range model says none of them should be approaching in the first place. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. Which brings the record back to where it started, to a stretch of calm, pewter-colored water off Panama City Beach, to a fishing boat idling past the sandbar before sunrise, to a spout thrown forward and to the left, unmistakable, gone before the boat could turn. No necropsy exists for that encounter because no carcass was ever recovered. No coordinates were logged beyond a captain's radio call. It sits permanently in the same category as most of what this investigation has uncovered. Real to the people who witnessed it, absent from the data set that defines where this species is allowed to be. Science has not been careless here. The depth-based model of Gulf sperm whale habitat is built on genuine survey data, genuine genetic sampling, decades of careful published research. It is very likely correct about where these animals prefer to be, where they feed, where the core of the population lives out its life a mile beneath the surface. What it cannot yet answer is the smaller, stranger question sitting underneath all of that certainty. Why, again and again, on a coastline, these whales are not supposed to approach. Someone keeps seeing one anyway. A range map is a summary of where a species has been confirmed, not a fence around where it is capable of going. The distinction sounds academic until you are the one standing on a dock at dawn, watching a shape too large and too slow-rolling to be anything you were told to expect, sinking back into water that, on paper, cannot possibly hold what you just saw. Not documented is not the same thing as not there. Somewhere off that same stretch of Panhandle coastline, on a morning with no charter boat close enough to notice, the pattern may already be repeating itself.